Hello, and welcome to another episode of Now Who Would Have Thought? Today we're going to take a journey back in time, back to a time where this great nation of ours earned its independence. You have all heard that freedom is not free, but do you really understand what the cost of freedom is? You will remember the cherry tree story long after you forget the more earth-shaking, history-making episodes in the life of George Washington. You have misplaced in your memory the details of Ben Franklin's statesmanship, but you remember him flying a kite. Joyce Kilmer was a great military hero, but the only thing you personally recall about him is his poetic tribute to trees. Maybe of this current decade, that which will be best remembered will not be its wars and its space travels, or its celebrities who lived and died. Maybe all that will survive to linger in the day-to-day vocabulary of generations yet unborn will be a song about a Tennessee frontiersman, or the incident at the window that night a speck of dust blew in and penicillin was discovered. You may not be able to quote a single line from the Declaration of Independence at this moment. Henceforth, you will always be able to quote at least one line. It's in the last paragraph where you will recall that it says, "We mutually pledge to each other our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor." You may recognize those impressive words, but do you truly understand them? Keep listening and you will. In the Pennsylvania State House, that's now called Independence Hall in Philadelphia, the best men from each of the colonies sat down together. It was a fortunate hour in our nation's history, one of those rare occasions in the lives of men when we had greatness to spare. These were men of means, well educated. 24 were lawyers and jurists, 11 were merchants, 9 were farmers and owners of large plantations. On June 11th, the committee sat down to draw up a Declaration of Independence. We were going to tell our British fatherland no more ruled by redcoats. Below the dam of ruthless foreign rule, the stream of freedom was running shallow and muddy. We were lighting the fuse to dynamite that day. This place, as Burke later put it, was a partnership between the living and the dead and the yet unborn. There was no bigotry or demagoguery in this group. All had shared hardships. Jefferson finished a draft of the document in 17 days. Congress adopted it in July. So much is familiar history. Now, King George III had denounced all rebels in America as traitors. Punishment for treason was hanging. The names, now so familiar to you from the several signatures, were secret for 6 months. For each knew the full meaning of that magnificent last paragraph, in which his signature pledged his life, his fortune, and his sacred honor. 56 men placed their names beneath that pledge. 56 men knew when they signed that they were risking everything. They knew if they won this fight, the absolute very best that they could expect would be years of hardship in a struggling nation. If they lost, they'd face a hangman's rope. But they signed the pledge, and they did indeed pay the price. Here is the documented fate of that gallant 56. Carter Braxton of Virginia, wealthy planter and trader, saw his ship swept from the seas. To pay his debts, he lost his home and all of his properties and died in rags. Thomas Lynch, Jr., who signed that pledge, was a third-generation rice grower, an aristocrat who owned a very large plantation. After he signed, his health failed. With his wife, he set out for France to regain his failing health. Their ship never made it to France. It was never heard from again. Thomas McKean of Delaware was so harassed by the enemy that he was forced to move his family 5 times in 5 months. He served in Congress without pay, his family in poverty and hiding. Vandals looted the properties of Ellery and Clymer and Hall and Gwinnett and Walton and Hayward and Rutledge and Middleton. Thomas Nelson, Jr. of Virginia raised $2 million on his own signature to provision our allies, the French fleet. After the war, he personally paid back the loans and wiped out his entire estate. He was never reimbursed by the government. In the final battle for Yorktown, he, Nelson, urged General Washington to fire on his home, which was occupied by Cornwallis. Nelson's home was destroyed. He died bankrupt and was buried in an unmarked grave. Thomas Nelson, Jr. had pledged his life, his fortune, and his sacred honor. The Hessians seized the home of Francis Hopkinson of New Jersey. Francis Lewis had his home and everything destroyed. His wife was imprisoned. She died within a few months. Richard Stockton, who signed that declaration, was captured and mistreated, and his health broken to the extent that he died at 51. His estate was pillaged. Thomas Hayward, Jr. was captured when Charleston fell. John Hart was driven from his wife's bedside while she was dying. Their 13 children fled in all directions for their lives. His fields and gristmill were laid to waste. For more than a year he lived in forests and caves, and returned home after the war to find his wife dead, his children gone, his properties gone. He died a few weeks later of exhaustion and a broken heart. Lewis Morris saw his land destroyed and his family scattered. Philip Livingston died within a few months from the hardships of the war. Now, John Hancock history remembers best due to a quirk of fate rather than anything that he stood for. That great sweeping signature attested to his vanity, towers over the others. One of the wealthiest men in New England, he stood outside Boston one terrible night of the war and said, "Burn Boston, though it makes John Hancock a beggar, if the public good requires it." He, too, lived up to the pledge. Of the 56, few were long to survive. 5 were captured by the British and tortured before they died. 12 had their homes from Rhode Island to Charleston sacked, looted, and occupied by the enemy, or burned. 2 lost their sons in the army. 1 had 2 sons captured. 9 of the 56 died in the war from its hardships or from its more merciful bullets. I do not know what impression you had of the men who met that hot summer day in Philadelphia, but I think it is important that we remember this about them. They were not poor men or wild-eyed pirates. They were men of means, rich men, most of them anyway, who enjoyed much ease and luxury in their personal living. Not hungry men, prosperous men. Wealthy landowners, substantially secure in their prosperity. But they considered liberty, and this is as much as I shall say of it, that they learned that liberty is so much more important than security, that they pledged their lives, their fortunes, and their sacred honor. And they fulfilled their pledge. They paid the price, and freedom was born. The Declaration of Independence, July 4th, 1776. For the support of this declaration, with a firm reliance on the protection of divine providence, we mutually pledge to each other our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor. Now, who would have thought? This is Chris McCrae. Take care of yourselves and the ones you love most.